One of the best innovations to fantasy footy over the last few years has been the in-season dual position additions. No longer are we stuck with what we get at the commencement of the year for the season long. We get a true reflection of what is happening in the AFL into our fantasy football sides. And so across multiple times during the 2025 season, we will once again see players pick up an additional position. The clarification: they need to spend at least 35%, according to champion data, 35% in a secondary position and play a minimum of 3 games to be eligible to pick up DPP. As the season goes on, it's not just that burst of 5, 6, 7 games that they're eligible and count. As the season goes on, they do view it in totality. So generally, if we're going to see a relevant player's named gaining a status, it's at the end of the first time. So who is going to pick up DPP? I've given you 16 names that I think that have some level of fantasy relevance that will pick up dual position status during the 2025 season. I've even got some stuff if you play draft on the keeper platform. I've got a couple of triple position players lined up for you at the end of the episode. Kicking off players I think that will gain defensive status right out of the gate. I'm going strong. Rory Laird. He spent some time towards the end of the 2024 season back into that more OG Rory Laird role, which is playing some half-back movement, a little bit of lockdown small defender, and still racking up a fair chunk of the pill. It did see a little bit of a dip in his fantasy scoring output, but he's going to hit that sort of 90s territory range for us anyway in AFL fantasy, and still knocking on the door, if not maybe slightly creeping over the 100 marker in SuperCoach. To me, this probably brings Rory back into fantasy relevance, because at the Crows over the last couple of years, they've started to venture into other outlets. So to me, I wouldn't draft him earlier in a draft, or I wouldn't pick him in Classic only with the expectation of DPP. But I think it's really clear the Crows have fixed that midfield issues that they've seemingly had over the last couple of years in terms of diversification of role, of speed, of skill set. And Rory's moved to that back line. I think he's an almost certain lock to pick up defensive status in 2025. Dylan Shield to pick up defensive status too. Not as confident that this is going to eventuate, but he's trained across this halfback run and carry role for Essendon throughout the entirety of the preseason. It seems like a Nick Martin has moved into a more midfield role. And so to me, I think that this is going to unfold, that Dylan Shield picks up defensive status. Again, will it be enough to make him relevant in Classic? I'm not too sure, because while he is a great run and carry option, really it's his work at clearance that has made him such an important AFL player over the better part of this decade. So skill set distribution-wise by foot, fine. But I wouldn't say he's elite by any means. And that's certainly what teams should and are looking for in this space. So I think he is going to pick it up should he play that distribution run and carry, much like a Dan Rioli kind of did for Richmond last year. So I think he's right in the mix. I'm going to stay in speculative spaces for a moment of players that I think will add defensive status. And again, like these other two, become a defender mid. Josh Dacos. I'm not sold that this is going to happen. I think he does his most damaging work across the wings. It's how he's midfield eligible, but it's enough training reports have come out that he's going to be spending some time across the halfback. Will it be that 35% threshold? I'm not too sure. The arrival of a Dan Houston does mean one of those flanks and distribution spaces are taken up, but there's a world where this could eventuate. So to me, I think it's a watch. I wouldn't change my draft ranks at all on a premise of it. I think it's more on the unlikely than likely side. We do see Josh Dacos picking up defensive status, but we've got to go by the training reports. That means he does sit in the consideration factor, and certainly someone to watch of picking up defensive status. Ollie Hollands is in next for me to pick up defensive status. He spent a few games towards the end of last season moving off the wing and becoming a run and carry player off this half-back line. A lot of people in the community are very bullish on the fact that Nick Newman's season-ending injury opens up the scoring pathway for Ollie. And while I agree in principle that there's a share of ball and a market share of movement that opens up an opportunity for Ollie, I'm not completely convinced that 1 + 1 = 2 in this case. Nick's a very, very different type of player and ball mover than what Ollie is. Ollie's a run and carry player. Nick is a precise kick. And they're just not the same sort of options. And Ollie's really got to tidy up that kicking. Even track watchers are still commenting that this is probably his undoing. Should he stay in this halfback role? So to me, I think it's on the probabilities. It's on the higher side. I think the thing that will cost him is, does he turn the ball over in spaces that ultimately hurt Carlton and they move him back to the wing? I'm not too sure. But he spent the entirety of the preseason training across halfback by all reports from track watchers. So to me, I think we can pencil this one in with some confidence. Not as high as Rory Laird, but I think with some confidence, I think we could see this one unfold. And then the last defender I've got picking up defensive status is Caleb Windsor. Again, much like Ollie, has moved from the wing last year into this halfback role, a little bit of a sharper and smoother both mover and user of the ball by hand and by foot, in contrast to an Ollie Hollands. He is currently navigating his way through an injury, but the club are confident that he'll be back early in the season, if not be right for the start of the year. So let's keep our eyes and ears on this one. But I think, should he get this run and carry role, I thought for a minute there it was going to be a Xavier Lindsay would get that spot, but it seems to be that Caleb Windsor is the guy they want to have in that halfback distribution role. Looking at the players that I think are going to add mid status, there's a couple. This is historically where we do see the greatest additions, and unfortunately generally don't add a whole ton of relevance to our classic or draft sides. Politely, these players that I think will all pick it up at some point during the season, if not at the first DPP change, they all, I think, will just add squad relevance to us, as all midfield gainers do, where really in draft it just means you can play around with your depth and not have to go to the waiver wire or the player pool to pick someone up. While in classic, it just maybe makes your trade cadence not get broken as much, because you can protect and cover options rolling through there. So still relevant, just not as highly specifically as the other three positional gains we might be seeing. Straight out of the gate, Colby McKercher for me. I'm pretty confident he's going to pick up midfield status in 2025. There's still conflicting reports about this current defender that I think will soon be a DPP player, about exactly where he'll sit. You go to one track watch of North Melbourne and he's playing exclusively across the wings. You go to the next one, he's floating between the arcs, but coming off a forward line or coming off the defensive line. Clearly, they're still working on and honing parts of his game as a footballer. They do love his skills on the outside. He's absolutely smooth and crisp in so many different areas. But the arrival of Caleb Daniel just means he doesn't have to be the primary ball mover by foot off that halfback line. I think he's still going to get a decent clip of time through there, but I can see him, Scott, and O'Sullivan really being the trio of wing options that they use, and wing classifies as a mid. So to me, I think he's going to do enough to pick up midfield status. Isaac Rankin will also gain midfield status as far as I'm concerned. He and the club have both been desperate to inject his clearance work, which is underrated in certainly the fantasy football community, is underrated what he does at stoppage and clearance. Really smart, really evasive, real high IQ footballer. It's taking that panic that defenders feel inside forward 50 for the Crows. It's now letting the midfield share some of that worry and concern as well. Really smart, crafty footballer. I can see a 60-40, 50-50 split really being the peak of what the share sort of looks like across the format. I think he's going to be a really nice forward option for us. This year, it's what made him so high in the 50 most relevant for me. If you haven't checked out that video series, wherever you're checking out this episode, go back and check it out. 50 players over the first 50 days of 2025 reviewed from a fantasy football perspective. I think this one is an absolute lock to come in for us, and right at the start of the season. So too is the addition of Sydney Swans captain Callum Mills as an add of midfield. he's going to be one of the best value buys in our fantasy footy teams as a defender this year. Dean Cox has come out now in multiple instances and declared that Callum Mills is moving back into this midfield. It was one of the pain points they had as the season went on. They weren't quite happy with that midfield mix, and Callum at his absolute best, while a chameleon that can play all roles, having him play those functions in the midfield, I think just protects and balances out the offensive nature of Goulden, of Warner and Heaney. It means Rowbottom is not doing all the defensive work because Mills is happy to get his hands dirty. It just adds a new look and shape in here. So I'd be shocked to see Sydney veer away from this. The good news for fantasy coaches, is where he's had those 110 fantasy seasons. So I'm bullish and quite keen on what he's going to be for us. So I think we could add this one in for us. Will Hoskin-Elliott, probably the most lowly relevant option we're going to see through there. His relevance is because he's currently eligible as a forward, but he always finds a way to get up and around the ground, play through the wings, spend plenty of time through the midfield. While not a centre bounce presence, he's a wingman. And if Dacos is drifting out of that space a little bit, probably it would safe to assume that Will Hoskin-Elliott's going to be back up around that ground a little bit more. He always finds a way to either lose mid status and then pick it up during the season, or lose forward status and pick it up during the season. It's as normative as Harley Reid news about him going to Essendon as a trade to freak out the West Coast Eagles fans. That's the level of normative that's going to happen. So to me, I think Will Hoskin-Elliott's going to pick up midfield status. And then the last midfield game that I've predicted for us is a Nick Martin. Currently defensive, eligible, but everything I can watch, see and observe, and from even going down to Essendon training myself on one occasion, Nick Martin is going to move back into the wing role where he's probably at his most damaging and a few years now removed from really being a consideration for that All-Australian spot, and then seeing him do some work on the inside as well. They're really liking that skill set dynamic that he's bringing. I think he's going to become more of a centre forward part of the ground. I think he's doing his most damage in that spot. And by everything we can see, hear and observe this preseason, he's moved off this halfback space and he's moved into a more midfield and outside role. So to me, I think that's more likely to happen. I've just got the one player picking up Ruck status, and it's Sam De Koning. Defender Ruck is what I'm forecasting for him to come and become for us again. Yes, you could have a double De Koning Ruck. That would be amazing, wouldn't it? Look, Toby Conway's hurt himself again. I just wish and hope for Toby's sake he could get his body right. He's showed so much promise, but unfortunately just his body doesn't seem yet to be up to the rigours of AFL football. Let's hope that changes. Can Geelong go back to the well with a Reece Stanley? Well, of course they can. Should they? That may be the better question, but I actually really liked the look of Sam De Koning when he played those handful of games last year in the Ruck, not just from a fantasy outlay of the scores it delivered for us, but also I just felt like it gave them a different look. Mark Blixarves will, of course, play that supplementary Ruck role, but he's at the age now and probably at the physical size where you don't want Mark rucking for long periods of times over multiple weeks. Him as the outlet, him as the secondary, no problem at all. But at regular stoppages and centre bounces, it's not what you want from Mark. So does Geelong go back to the future with a Reece Stanley? Look, probably they do. But I'd love to see the Sam De Koning move. With Conway now injured, it opens a clearer step and evolution forward for Sam to take that spot. He has spent big chunks of the preseason training and developing his ruck craft. Whether or not we see Geelong throw him into that spot, we'll have to wait and see. But to me, I'm going to go out and say I think Sam De Koning is going to pick up ruck status. To me, it probably makes them look at their healthiest and strongest as a side with him in that position. So I'm happy to make that call. Let's look at some guys that I probably should mention one other mid that I kind of skimmed over him because it feels so assumed, but I probably should mention it. Adding midfield status, I think it's Jackson McRae. He's going to be the number 2 mid behind Jack Steele. I know I'm getting it out of order, but I just had to mention it because if I forgot him, you'd be like, MJ, you missed the most obvious. I did almost completely overlook him because it feels so obvious and overt. probably the most bankable DPP addition we're going to see that I'm forecasting through. Jackson McRae at mid status. You've got him in your forward lines already in Classic, don't you? Jog on, MJ. Next, let's hit some forwards. I'm hitting speculative territories here. Not going to lie, but just going to read some tea leaves. James Sicily to add forward status. I think the arrival of Battle and Barras, alongside the injuries to Lewis and Kalshadir, do create a pathway where, at least early in the season, James Sicily becomes the option that they throw forward, much like they did in critical final quarters of 2024. It's how he started his career as a footballer. I think it might just be how he ends it too. He's elite at so many things, at reading the play, doing some great setting up of their ball, moving across half back. But I think he's still damaging enough to go forward. And with those outlets that they've got now that are interceptors in Battle and Barras, and the absence of forward structure with those other two tools out, I think it makes a lot of sense and a narrative for why. So let's watch and observe these preseason and practice games with interest. But to me, I think this might just be the pathway. And politely, from a fantasy coach, this is what we should want. We should want James Sicily moving forward for two reasons. One, it'll likely see a diminishing score return, which brings his price point down in Classic. But two, adding forward status to a line that we're not really overwhelmed with high-end options. Sicily's dual position status could be absolutely vital to not only squad versatility through the season, but if he then does move back and get into that 90s AFL Fantasy and 100s SuperCoach intercepting and general that sets up the ball movement for Hawks, this is actually the most perfect pathway for us. So I know some are like, nah, I don't want any piece of Sicily forward. No, you don't want any piece of him there. You want the piece of once he gains the status and moves back. So to me, I've got James Sicily ending back into the forward line only to move back into the defensive line. Let's go 4 speculative ones. Jordan De Goey to pick up mid-forward status. I think with, again, some challenges in the off-season for Jordan, I think that we could see a pathway where Collingwood ease him back in to the midfield role. And I think that's the most probable and likely outcome. Their forward line is still quite diverse with options, but De Goey is still so damaging when he's inside that space. And so as they rebuild his body and confidence, unfortunately yet again in his body, I think there's an outcome here where he could pick up forward status. Am I banking on it? No. Is it a high probability? No. But the premise of the video is players that I think are potentials to pick up DPP during the season. And so given what I know Jordan has done as a forward, and that I think they'll try to rebuild confidence in his body, it makes the most sense to do that through more time forward that he already has. He spends time inside forward 50 anyway, with rest and creating damaging one-on-one options. I just think if we get that percentage just bumped towards that 35% in those first few games of the year, we might just get a little bit lucky. So too with a Tuke Miller. I think there's a world where he adds forward status. With him handing over the captaincy reins to Noah Anderson, it does feel like, while he's still perfectly got youth on his side, he's in his 20s, for goodness sake. So it's not exactly like we're rolling him out to pasture here. I just think that Damien Hardwick likes the midfield look of Anderson, of Flanders, and of Rowell. I think he likes that dynamic. And someone like a Tuke Miller can use his work rate to then become the fourth option around stoppage, but he can come out into that position, not just from a centre bounce prospect, but coming high off that half forward. So I can really see him using his elite running, just an absolute elite work rate option, just pushing up and down and becoming an additional midfielder around the ground and really exposing the defender that lands on him. So I think, and have seen some training reports coming out that he spent some time off half forward. Again, we need to see it in game. But to me, I think this makes a lot of sense. And from a fantasy perspective, we'd love this, wouldn't we? This one would just be awesome. And then the last two, I think, are on the more unlikely side, but on the balance of probabilities, they're a potential. So we're going to throw them in there. Christian Petrarca adding forward status. I think it will come at some point yet again in his career. He's still not in full contact work yet, according to the club, when it comes to training. And so certainly not going to see him in the next day or two do too much contact work. We'll wait and see what that is. The club are confident that he'll be right for that community series match is what we're hearing. Any other practice games prior to that, we're not expected to see him play. I think, again, he's so damaging forward of the ball. They've got some options now that can play through this midfield, with a Rivers spending a little bit more time through another pre-season of training through the midfield. Clayton Oliver's back to his best. Viney, I know, is again another player that they're worried about touch and go being right for round one. But I just think with Christian Petrarca, if we can get enough forward time early in the year, it might just come our way, because as the year goes on, it's his confidence in his body and his health. I just don't think that will happen enough. But to me, I do like the look of Christian Petrarca forward. If he gains mid-forward status, this could be the number one forward from when he gains it to the end of the year. He's got that potential. It's been, 2020, I think was the last year he was forward eligible for us. But I do think he was close to the mark at the end of last season, had his lowest centre bounce presence since CBAs had been tracked. I think this one's, it's not likely. I wouldn't say it's probable, but it's highly possible. Look at me hedging my bets here on my sentiments and statements around this. Then the last forward that I think is going to pick up dual position status, I think we could be in for a shock here, but Hayden Young. Spent a good chunk of time forward last year, moved into that midfield almost exclusively. And then as the year went on, they did like that damaging look and shape of him. He's such a hard matchup, not just from a height, but his just ability to read the play, which made him such a good interceptor and playmaker across half back. But he's just a beautiful kick of the football, set shot and in play. I think he actually adds a little bit of a weapon to this forward line that, yes, the addition of a Bolton has added another dynamic. A miss, Jackson, they're looking perfectly weaponized inside forward 50. But I think there's just something about that matchup of Hayden Young forward that if that exposes opposition teams enough, I can see Longmuir exposing that for longer periods of the game, because they've got options that can roll through this midfield. And while I do think Hayden Young will still get plenty of centre bounce, Brayshaw and Sarong are the centerpieces, but you've got guys like Johnson, who they've been looking to give opportunities to get into this space. If Nat Fyfe is fit, he's going to get a spot. If Neil Erasmus can get himself in the best 23, he's in there. Bolton is more than capable of running spots through there. So they're not exactly skinny of names and options that can roll through there, even if Hayden Young split out of the midfield and back into a secondary position does hold up. So to me, it's not highly probable, but it's possible. And that's exactly what this list is about. Hey, and then I've got three names for you that if you're playing on the Keeper platform, where it is unbelievable what this platform has done. It is where the coaches panel is drafting in 2025. It is perfect for single season, dynasty, or Keeper leagues. The customizations are incredible. The draft experience, I've done multiple drafts on Keeper now, has been flawless, whether you're doing trades, whatever you want to do. Keeper lets you do it. An unbelievable draft platform, probably the best I've ever seen in the AFL community. Have given coaches a new, based on demand, a new feature that you can have. They have their own positional allocations that come during the year, which you get exclusively here on the Coaches Panel channel when they land. But also, they give you the option for something called a triple position player. Last year, a player such as a Dane Zorko would have been eligible, who was a mid-forward, but was playing in defence, and so could gain a triple position. I've got three guys that I think could become triple position players for us to start the year. You ready for them? Caleb Daniel, I think, is probably the most likely to pick it up for us as well. Currently midfield forward, but every bit of talk coming out of North Melbourne is that he is playing that playmaker, quarterback distribution role off half back, which is not only what's made him a premium performer for us over previous seasons, but also means I think he's probably guaranteed to pick up TPP for us. And imagine that in playing through bye league weeks where you just need players to plug and fill gaps. A player like a Caleb Daniel we know he's going to be in and around that 90s sort of range of average, if indeed he does play this role, which I think is almost certain to happen. Having a guy that can play mid, defender, forward during those mid-season buys is unbelievable. So to me, I think this one's almost certain that this one's going to land for us. Then, not certain, but highly probable would be a Liam Baker to add defensive status. Again, another dual position option for us at the moment. But I can just see Liam Baker playing in that halfback role. All the talk is that he's got that spot, and under Minnie McWalter, who he spent some time for many years at Richmond under. I think this one makes a bit of sense for us. So Liam Baker to pick up the status, I think that one might just happen. It's not as banked as Caleb Daniel in my eyes, but certainly on the ends of possibilities. And then the last one I'll throw in the mix for you is Caleb Daniel, who I've done. Liam Baker I've done. Sam Flanders. I think he'd pick up forward status for us and become a defender mid-forward like all three of these guys. I think this one could land. His time across halfback is done, and I think he's going to have that split mid-forward role. Should it be enough percentage of split between mid and forward? Probably depends on whether or not the Tuke Miller DPP lands in his favour or not. But to me, I can see this one landing for us and a Sam Flanders becoming a really critical and vital piece for us. But who do you think is going to pick up dual position status or triple position status during the season? I'd love to know your thoughts. If you're watching this episode, you can comment below and let us know. Give us a couple of names that you're confident will pick up DPP during the season. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, make sure you do so. Give this video a like. We'd certainly greatly appreciate it. We'll be back again tomorrow with another episode on the channel as we get closer to opening round and the start of your fantasy footy season for 2025.